Coming from a choral tradition, I personally don't always like to use this. So even in an ensemble where there is no singing, I would like sometimes to still conduct with my hands. And the reason being is that there's more expression in the hands than there is in a stick. So the stick moves up and down like so. And one can certainly be expressive when conducting with a stick. However, one can be more expressive when conducting with the hands. Thank you. So that I personally believe there's more expression in the body than there is when using a stick. So for certain occasions, it does, even though it's not necessarily part of the tradition, it is important to use the hands to express and also to shape and follow the melody and all of the necessary contours that happen with it. Now, there are some conductors that don't exclusively use the baton. One in particular would be Kurt Masur, who was the former New York Philharmonic director. I have never seen use a baton. And of course, if you go back in history, Leopold Stokowski is another one that comes to mind who didn't use the baton. And in fact, if any of you remember the Bugs Bunny, am I drawing a blank here with the Bugs Bunny breaking of the baton? Leopold, do you remember that? Anyways, that was a parody of Leopold Stokowski, and he also did not use a baton. So it is done, although there are certain things that are necessary with the baton, and I will definitely cover those later on for you. Now, when we talk about conducting, we talk about leading, and I need to reference a couple of very important conductors over the years that perhaps some of you may or may not know. Now, the first very, very well-known, and in fact, probably the greatest conductor, you could say, of the 20th century was Arturo Toscanini. Now, Toscanini became famous in North America for conducting the NBC Symphony Orchestra. However, he was also a very prominent and, in fact, world-class conductor clearly before then, and he was essentially in charge of La Scala for many years and gave it its great reputation. So the other person who I believe was the equal of Toscanini was Wilhelm Furtwängler, and he actually lived up until just about the end of the Second World War. I think he may have died in the early 50s, and he was the principal conductor of the Berlin Philharmonic. Furtwängler was the antithesis of Toscanini. If you have ever seen any videos of Furtwängler conduct, I'm not sure if you could even distinguish where his pattern was a lot of the time. But yet, his orchestra followed him to the T, and he was able to shape incredible and beautiful interpretations. And I have to relay a story to you, which is one that I find very moving and inspiring in terms of leadership. Now, if we contrast, we can clearly contrast between Toscanini and Furtwängler in one simple example. Some of you may know that Toscanini was considered a very difficult man, a very tyrannical conductor, and he would start and begin tirades with his orchestra and sometimes belittle his musicians and so on. So he created a respect that was followed, and he also created an incredibly good orchestra because they were all afraid of him. Furtwängler did the complete opposite. He inspired his orchestra, and even though he was technically not a very clear or what you would consider a very easy conductor to follow, his orchestra was so inspired by him that members of the orchestra, when he died, considered giving up playing music. That's how much of an influence he had. And on top of that, there's a wonderful story that I saw one time. The timpani player was relaying the story back on a video that I watched about conducting, and he said he was watching a Berlin Philharmonic rehearsal. He was in the orchestra, but he doesn't play very much because he's a timpani player, so they only play every once in a while. So they listen to long orchestral tutti. So they're listening to this. He's listening to this rehearsal, and it was not Furtwängler who was conducting, it was someone else. So he sat and listened to this rehearsal, and then about halfway through this rehearsal, he just noticed that all of a sudden the orchestra was playing so much better. They were playing beautiful phrases. They were doing everything that they needed to do, plus more. And he couldn't understand why all of a sudden is this orchestra playing so much better than it was 5 minutes ago. And he tried to figure this out, and then he looked around in the room, and then he noticed that 5 minutes before, Furtwängler had walked into the room. And just by his mere presence, it changed everything in that orchestra, even though he wasn't conducting it. He walked in, and they saw him, and they were not going to play poorly. They were going to play well for him, just because he was in the room. That is the type of inspiration that I think conductors need to follow.